Huawei hasn't been out of the headlines very often recently, but this week found itself at the very centre of the ongoing trade conflict between the US and China. Several US firms, including Google, restricted access to Huawei in order to comply with a US barring order. Foreign companies, such as Japan's Panasonic, are considering doing the same. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Huawei is dishonest about the extent of its ties to Beijing.
That's just false. To say that they don't work with the Chinese government is a false statement. It's just the Huawei CEO, on that at least, isn't telling the American people the truth, nor the world.
Several Chinese government spokespeople spoke out against the US moves. The use of state power by the United States to suppress Chinese companies has not only seriously damaged normal commercial cooperation between the firms of the countries, but has also caused a serious threat to the security of global industry and global supply chains. China resolutely opposes this. Since trade talks between Beijing and Washington started to flounder, the trade dispute has increasingly looked like one as much about technological prowess as anything else. The US hopes the pressure on Huawei may yet prove a powerful bargaining tool in the overall trade negotiation, if it gets going again. But as the rhetoric gets more heated, the reaction from the markets gets clearer. Stocks slumped globally on Thursday, and analysts say it will get worse before it gets better.
All right, for more, let's cross over to Lars Halter, our financial market correspondent in Frankfurt. Lars, meanwhile, the US President Donald Trump has said he could imagine Huawei being part of a US-China trade deal, even though Huawei is, quote, very dangerous. What do we make of that?
Well, it's a little bit of a good cop, bad cop game here that he seems to be playing, Monica, and I think it is really just that it is a game, and all in all, it looks a little incompetent. The thing is here, if Huawei is as dangerous as President Trump makes it sound, if they're dangerous from a military perspective, as you also said, because they allow spying, then that problem cannot be solved by just incorporating Huawei into a major trade deal. Then it has to be dealt with. And so that doesn't really go together that well. It looks a lot more like what we've seen over the last couple of months, that President Trump is just winging it. He's just doing his trade deals here with no coherent plan. And that is exactly what has the markets worried here in Frankfurt, but of course even more so on Wall Street, because we have seen over the last couple of months every new tariffs gets answered with a counter tariff. What happens now if you ban companies in their businesses? Does that get a similar reaction from Beijing? That is what a lot of the tech companies are worried about. Apple, for example, all the major chip makers, Intel, Qualcomm or so, because they have major business, of course, with China.
All right, Lars, only tech companies taking a hit?
Tech companies obviously are mostly affected by that, but they're not the only ones. There's companies, if you just look at some of the American companies in the Dow Jones, it's Caterpillar, there's Boeing or so. A lot of these companies that very much depend on exports, and a lot of their business is, of course, exports specifically to China. They would be affected just as much.
All right, Lars Halter there in Frankfurt. Thank you so much. In a stroke of irony, those currently hardest hit by the US-China trade conflict are some of Donald Trump's most loyal supporters, farmers. Now the US government has signed off a $16 billion aid program, but many farmers say all they want is a return to normality.
Don and Pat Swanson are sixth-generation farmers here in Iowa. Their main crops are soybeans and maize. They also have cattle. But since China began retaliating against the US government's levies on Chinese goods, business here has slowed significantly.
China's a huge customer. They have a lot of people in China, and they were taking 1 row of every 3 rows that we plant of soybeans. That's a lot of soybeans that they were taking. So to lose that market last year has hurt us, and I think will hurt us for a while.
And yet, these are loyal Trump supporters who still believe his policies are the right way to go, as does nearby fellow farmer Dave Walton.
China's been a bad actor on a world stage. You know, they've manipulated currency, they've manipulated the allowance of imports into the country. So they've done a lot of things that manipulates the trade beyond tariffs and other barriers. So I think we will be better off when this finally gets resolved, but it's that period of time from beginning to end that it's painful right now.
Usually 60% of US soybeans are sold to China. Now there's nowhere for the crops to go. Soybean prices haven't been this low for a decade, and there's unlikely to be much upswing until the US and China find a way through.